Hello, everyone. Welcome to our March in the Room. Really delighted to see your faces and to have tonight with us Fiona Sampey and Amy Vance, who are both seasoned clinicians, different areas of medical expertise, but who really specialize in supporting families with advanced care planning and specifically medical orders to support and empower the child and the family in what their care goals are so that as things become more complicated, parents and the child, if and as the child is able to make decisions, has agency in how things progress. Always with a focus on quality of life and that intersection of medical interventions and what is possible where it meets with quality of life and a parent and child's goal for their quality of life. I'm Blythe Lord. I'm the executive director. My daughter Cameron passed away, died at the age of 2, and my husband did medical orders with our pediatrician, Dr. Goldstein. With my blessing, I opted not to be present for that. It was not something I wanted to do in person because I had somebody who was going to do it for me. If I had been on my own, I certainly would have, because I had strong feelings about what I did and didn't want for Cameron's life. I would have done it if my husband wasn't able to represent us in these conversations. And we were very lucky because we we didn't differ in our wishes for our daughter. I can imagine that that is not always the case, and luckily Fiona and Amy will talk us through some of that. The way this is going to go is I'm going to hand it over to Fiona and Amy, and they're going to walk us through what medical orders and more advanced directives, let's say, because there's so much more than the orders themselves in these forms you might hear about, like do not resuscitate form or allow natural death. It's so much more than that. It's all about the loving decisions that we make, not the specific forms that that are a tool of it. They're going to walk us through that. Feel free to put your questions or comments into the chat while that's happening. And then afterwards, we will open it up to questions and comments and observations. Some of you here tonight, I know, have experience, and I may be calling or asking you to contribute your experience as you are comfortable. All right, so without further ado, this is being recorded, and we will send out a recording with a follow-up email afterwards. All right, Fiona and Amy, thank you for being with us. And please introduce yourselves and talk a little bit about how you even came to do this work.
Thanks, Blythe. I am just going to share my screen to start.
We did. We know you can do this because 15 minutes ago it worked beautifully.
Yeah.
There it is.
All right. Good evening, everyone. I'm Fiona Sampey. I am a palliative care provider. I have worked in this field for the past decade and had the privilege of taking care of probably hundreds to thousands of families. I have seen patients across the age continuum with a special interest in pediatric palliative care patients. I just want to thank Blythe for the introduction, and most especially for rooting our discussion as a deeply personal topic by sharing a piece of your and Cameron's story. We are so thrilled to have this opportunity to engage with the wonderful CPN community and hope that this can be an informative discussion for all of us. Blythe had asked us to talk a little bit about how Amy and I got to be interested in offering our services as a consultative service outside of the hospital. through our organization, Advanced Conversations. So as many of you know, one of the primary goals of palliative care is to help patients and families make well-informed healthcare decisions that support their goals and wishes. And advanced directives can be a tool that supports this. Unfortunately, what we've seen time and again are that advanced care planning and decision making is often not discussed with patients and families in a really thorough manner or upstream of a stressful emergent event. And that's really when patients and families can make thoughtful and truly shared decisions. So we wanted to create a space for that and help facilitate family units having these discussions together.
Hello, my name is Amy Vance, and I have had the opportunity to work shoulder to shoulder with Fiona, and I really appreciate this opportunity to be here this evening. I think sort of one of the passions that I have is having that time with family that isn't always possible in sort of our fast-paced medical setting. And, we wanted to have that space to offer because I think sometimes we also, not only what we can share with people on our expertise on advanced planning, but also that space to listen to families and what's important to them and what their goals are and what their fears are, all of those pieces. So I think we feel very passionate about having that time with families, learning from them, and providing information back as well.
So parents of children with complex medical conditions often have many things that they've considered related to advanced directives. These might include questions like, can my family complete advanced directives for our child on our own? Or my child's medical provider hasn't spoken with us about code status or advanced directives. How do I bring this topic up? And I don't want my child to go through CPR. Is that okay? And how do I defend that choice to my extended family?
Right. And we also hear, my partner and I don't agree on how much intensive medical care we're comfortable with for our child. And how can we work on making these decisions together as a team? And how much should I include my child in these decisions? And if so, how do I even initiate that conversation? Once we complete like a form or a piece on the advanced directives, what if we want to make changes to it?
Also, can a medical provider override my family's decisions? And can a backup decision maker override my family's decisions if we're not able to be part of an urgent medical discussion ourselves? So we're going to discuss these topics in the context of the what, why, when, who, and where of advanced care planning. As Blythe said, put whatever other questions you have in the chat. Blythe will be monitoring it. And at the end of the presentation, we'll circle back and make sure that we've answered all your great questions.
So what are advanced directives? And I think, Blythe, I think you said it so well. I think it's about the intentions of the life that we want to express in our wishes. It isn't about a piece of paper. We might use those pieces of paper to help facilitate conversations, to help, document what our goals and wishes are. But it isn't about the paper, right? It's about the patient and the family. And I think that's always such an important place to start. So it is, it is how you want your child to live and how you want them treated medically. So just, I think it's important to talk a little bit about the terminology and sort of thinking things in terms of what is current, right here and now, and what we're planning for in the future. So just a few sort of notes on that. I think often people in a hospital, although conversations might not be had, but people are often asked, what is your child's code status? or what is your, what is the code status? And that is a designation in a hospital setting of, let's say, no CPR, DNR, or full code. I think it's important to know that if you're ever in a hospital, the default is always full code, everything, unless it is designated otherwise. And I think that's important, and that's really across the board, unless that is documented and repeated documented. In that sort of acute setting, in a home environment or a documentation that is an order, an active order is called a POLST. People refer to it as a MOLST. It's the provider order of life-sustaining treatment, which is a mouthful. But the nice thing about that, it is consistent across the state. So it's usually 1 or 2 pages. It is usually a color that is designated by the state. You can see the one on the screen is green. The key to that, it is recognized by EMS. So where advanced directives, which we'll talk about in a minute, a POLST is recognized kind of across the board by EMS. It is signed by both the healthcare power of attorney, and it is signed by a medical provider. It can be changed at any time, and the most current dated is the valid POLST form. This usually is a form that is typically only used when people are limiting escalation of care. So if they are designating DNR or do not intubate, whatever those pieces are, and it is that quick communication to EMS or to other providers, and we'll talk about sort of the where of that in a little bit. And then when we think of a little bit bigger picture and futuristic and planning and often more generalized, there are tools that are in the advanced directives. So there are tools out there that help us with children. So we talk about My Wishes, which is for school-age children, which has more simple questions that can help facilitate things, and Voicing My Choices, which is for more adolescents and young adults. And those can be found on My Wishes, and it can be found online to help and again, to help facilitate that conversation as much as the form filling out. And then lastly, just the healthcare power of attorney. On behalf of children, if parents are by default their healthcare power of attorney. Where it needs additional paperwork is if there's guardianship, if there is divorce and there are custody issues, then it is important that that healthcare power of attorney has more specific designation and might require a lawyer or certainly signatures documenting who is the healthcare power of attorney. But I think even in the setting where the custody, there isn't issues regarding that, parents might think about secondary power of attorney beyond them as decision makers. So there can be situations where parents aren't available, or if something happens to them, and sort of having that conversation and documenting who would be decision makers on their children's behalf, both secondary and sometimes even tertiary beyond that person. And I think that that's very important.
Those healthcare power of attorney forms that Amy was discussing, those would also typically be completed with a lawyer, not necessarily a healthcare provider, if they're not super straightforward. If it's the default parents, you can document that with the healthcare provider on some of the other forms that she mentioned. So why are advanced directives important? First of all, we've talked about helping honor your and your child's wishes. I first became interested in palliative care when I was a provider on a pediatric bone marrow transplant unit. And I became very aware and distressed that many of the teens who were being cared for on that unit were very aware of the severity of their medical conditions and experiencing a lot of medical trauma. And they were still often given really limited involvement in upstream decision making related to if their condition worsened. And so that was really my initial impetus for working in this field, is wanting to amplify, both the child's voice and the family's voice. Advanced directives can also help ensure that the medical care that your child receives is beneficial and doesn't cause unnecessary suffering. Similarly, advanced directives can ensure that medical care is balanced with quality of life considerations. As you all know, quality of life is so individual. I would say that most of us as adults want to live as well as possible for as long as possible, but there may be other priorities if those can't be achieved in tandem. And I think for children and families facing complex illness, the same holds true. Advanced care planning can also be an opportunity to understand components of CPR, define what life-sustaining treatment is for your child, and discuss individual considerations and outcomes based on your individual child's medical condition. Again, there's a lot that can be offered medically that doesn't necessarily benefit every patient and family. A few important things to know about CPR. So healthcare providers, including EMS, are required to do CPR unless limitations are legally documented. Chest compressions and intubation typically have to be done in tandem if the goal is surviving a cardiopulmonary arrest. But there also are certain medical conditions and situations where choosing one or the other intervention makes sense medically. That's referred to as a modified code, and is something that your healthcare provider can talk you through depending on your child's overall medical condition. Artificial hydration and nutrition and antibiotics may also be considered life-sustaining support, but are usually not an emergent consideration. But sometimes they are items that are asked about on advanced directive forms like the PULSE form. Sometimes medical providers won't honor a DNR order if a cardiac arrest occurs during a surgery or procedure, because it may have been caused by the act of doing the surgery or procedure. I bring this up because if for your child, it's important that that DNR status is honored no matter what. That's an important thing to talk to like an anesthesiologist or a surgeon who's doing a surgery or procedure on your child about. And then the PULSE form specifically is a tool for documenting limitations, as Amy said, but it's yours to produce or not. And so sometimes families will have that as a safeguard at home in case their child passes at home and they don't want, CPR done when they have clearly already passed, but they may want the option of CPR in other circumstances. So, know that even if you have a PULSE form completed, you put it somewhere safe. It's yours to produce or not, depending on the situation. And EMS and the hospital are always available to you and your child. Advanced directives are also an opportunity to make decisions upstream of stressful, urgent, or emergent medical situations. This might include considering what you would want if your child experienced a secondary life-threatening event that is independent of their primary medical condition. So, examples would be like if they had a life-threatening choking event or an unexpected trauma like a motor vehicle accident. Thinking about these things outside of those stressful situations can really help with conflict within families, between families and the healthcare team, and within the healthcare team itself. I also think it allows the parents or whoever are the healthcare powers of attorney be able to make those decisions without like other children present or family that you might not want involved in decision making. Advanced directives can also help prevent a domino effect of hard decisions. So, for example, if your child had a prolonged intubation on a ventilator and was not improving, we would anticipate that at some point in time, there might be a discussion between the parents and the healthcare providers about next steps, including, tracheostomy and feeding tube versus trialing an extubation with the knowledge that that might be compassionate and result in the child's death. Additionally, for children who have technology like feeding tubes or trachs, if those are not supporting good quality of life for them, there may be discussions about stopping those supports. And I bring this up because I've seen over time that stopping life-sustaining support can often feel more emotional to families than making well-informed decisions not to initiate them in the first place. Advanced directives can also stand as a legal and emotional protection for family if a child dies at home, especially off hospice. This goes back to what I was explaining about producing a pulse or not. If you anticipate that this scenario could happen in your home, if you have a DNR pulse in place, that can really simplify the process, the legal process, and lessen the trauma of that situation.
So when should you start this process? I think Fiona and I would both resounding say now, but I think in truth, really, we mean that it's never too soon, right? Because it's starts with the conversation, and we know, and it goes back to sort of why we do this, that the time isn't in the ER during a point of crisis. Because it's just so hard to have, really, it's really hard on the family during that time. And I think we understand that it's hard to just sort of come up to do this, on a Tuesday at 2:00 to decide to do it. But it is important. And I actually do think one way to start it is to add an appointment when you make your list of questions to discuss it with that main provider, your quarterback provider, to bring it up and to set a space either with them, or if they can help you facilitate an appointment that's with a, palliative care social worker or social worker, that they can facilitate that conversation in a space that works for you, that is not in crisis. And I think sometimes, and all of this depends on family dynamics and all that goes into it, it's hard to make that first, because it is tough conversations and tough planning pieces. But I think universally, when we see people that complete these and when they have these discussions, the burden diminishes dramatically. So we see people sort of relax and, I didn't, I thought was the only one who thought that, we see sort of people, the bubble release. And I think people knowing that what you've decided today can always be changed. It's your platform today is a key of being able to do it now, because it's not set in stone. You are always able to change.
I think Amy and I would also say that, Ideally the healthcare provider, this is on their mental lists of things that they should be talking with you about in order to be, supporting your child's quality of life and doing things that are beneficial for them. If they don't bring that up, I would, as a parent, frame it in that way, saying to the provider that, you really want to make sure that as you're making decisions about your child's healthcare going forward, that you're being mindful about what's beneficial or not beneficial about medical care, what supports good quality of life, and that you want to start a discussion about this. So, who should be part of these conversations? So, I'll start with the participant that there's typically the most uncertainty around involving. That's the child. And there's various considerations related to, if and when the child should be involved. That's, very personal and, relates to your child's psychological, social, developmental capacity, their age, the legal age of consent, which refers to a patient's ability to make independent, complex decisions, versus assent, which refers to a patient's ability to understand and agree with a decision that's being made on their behalf by an adult who is giving legal consent. So that would typically be the parent. These concepts of consent and assent vary by state and healthcare facility. So that's an important thing to ask about. I would also encourage you to, lean into knowing that you know your child best. And so if you think that regardless of their age, they're, asking you important questions and you want them to be part of like decision making or information getting, then I think that's great to advocate for that. You can utilize their healthcare interdisciplinary team to also assess their ability and desire to engage and to support and amplify your child's voice. So this is folks like Child Life Therapeutic Rec, child psychology, social work, chaplaincy. Those folks are also, of course, there for you as the parent in kind of sifting through this. I would say that it's really common for children to protect their families by not expressing their worries or wishes, but they might be willing to do so with someone they trust on the healthcare team. Both you and the healthcare team can start with really simplistic questions, which of course would depend on their age, but just for example, asking them what they understand about their medical condition, if they have any worries when they come to the hospital, and things that are important to them when they are not feeling well or in the hospital. So non-threatening questions to kind of open up the conversation. The resources that Amy mentioned, My Wishes and Voicing My Choices, have a lot of questions like that as a guide. And I would say, even though the Voicing My Choices guide is for adolescents and teens, again, depending on your child's kind of developmental stage, My Wishes might be more appropriate for some older children, and the Voicing My Choices might be more appropriate for some younger children. And then, of course, we want the healthcare power of attorneys to be part of these discussions. Like Amy said, this is typically the parents equally. If that's not the case, that should be like well documented, and whoever are the legally designated healthcare power of attorneys should be present. And then whoever you identify as, your trusted healthcare provider or providers. The information that they should be sharing in this discussion is pretty thorough information around your child's diagnosis and prognosis, what that information means in terms of their disease trajectory, life expectancy, and the intent of their treatment. What I mean by that is their disease something that is curable, or the goal of their treatment is, to help them live as well as possible for as long as possible with a more palliative approach. Also, functional and quality of life considerations. This should all happen in this larger framework of exploring your family's values, goals, and wishes. That's the most important piece. Providers should be giving you clear recommendations around what medical care they anticipate would or would not be beneficial to your child. If they don't readily offer that up, I would ask them to do that. I think that information is really helpful for families to lean on, both for themselves with the emotional weight of these decisions. And then we got a question through the registration around, if other family members were questioning your choices, how to respond to that. I think, again, going back to what you've been told by your healthcare providers in guidance around what care is beneficial and supports good quality of life for your child. That can be kind of helpful to use in that way too. And then for some families, having a third-party facilitator can be an added step that can be helpful, especially if there's a need for more understanding around the medical information that's being provided, if there's some misalignment in values or goals. I would say it's really not uncommon for there initially to be some differences in wishes between parents, but usually, the values and like hopes that they have for their child, you can find kind of common ground and give recommendations of what achieves those goals. Palliative care, if you have access to that at your healthcare facility, is helpful as a third-party facilitator, or an independent consultant like me or Amy can be helpful in those situations too. When I was preparing for this presentation, I couldn't remember a situation where, with more extensive exploration of, medical information, values, and goals, where we weren't able to help parents come to, a shared understanding and agreement of what they wanted for their child. But it may entail multiple conversations. And I think just giving yourselves grace and knowing that that's normal is a piece of the process. And then some of these documents may require a notary or a lawyer.
Okay, so where should these, advanced directives, pulse forms that we've been talking about, where do you put them? Where are they kept? Where do you have them accessible? And maybe filed isn't the right word, because I think accessibility to it is key. One place we advise for the most current advanced directives in pulse form would be part of the electronic medical record. And that it is flagged as part of your child's chart, as well as, if it's not directly tied to it, with your pediatrician, primary care provider, and then specialists that your child may see. Many states now have repositories where you can actually just very easily Google that, your state, and do they have repository storage for advanced directives, which is nice. Usually samples of advanced directives, usually more geared towards adults, I feel, but are available as well. But then when we talk about our home, of course, advanced directives are one thing, but when we talk about that pulse form, it is fairly specific of where, let's say, EMS is called, And we want to present that post form. And again, Fiona mentioned that you can keep it in a drawer and it's not accessible, but I think assuming that you want that displayed and accessible to EMS, they look for it first on the fridge, and it can be a note on a side of a fridge to say, see, if you don't want that post hanging on your fridge for every time you access it, which makes sense, you can put a note that it's in the drawer. You can kind of point to it. Some people I've even seen keep in the fridge in a jar, and they just have a note on the side. It can be kept in a medicine cabinet as well. So that's important. In addition to does your child live in two homes? It should be in both homes, or, and should it travel with them? So like if they have a mobile medical kit and they're going to, a caregiver's home, that isn't their standard home, should that travel with them? And that sort of follows. And there's situations where you want to communicate it to the local fire department, even, whatever that may be. And then I think an important conversation has to occur regarding schools. So if your child attends school, every school is different in terms of whether they honor that post form or those advanced directives and your wishes. So what we would recommend is you sit down with that administrator and counselor with those forms, ideally, both healthcare power of attorneys with those forms, and know what your policies of that school is, because you wouldn't want a crisis to occur and there sort of not to be an understanding of what the expectation of escalation of care, et cetera, would be. So I think that that's really important. And then to just consider other spaces where your child spends a lot of time, and having those forms accessible is key.
Amy, just one question that's very specific to what you said from Naomi. Are electronic copies accepted by hospitals and all, or do they, like, if you scan the most, is all of that acceptable?
Yes. Fiona, I haven't seen any time where a scanned or electronic isn't accessible. It doesn't have to be for example, when we talked about the colors, it doesn't have to be that color just creates that alert. And now there are post forms that are actually online and accessible.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, because we receive them sometimes from folks like via email, and then we would print them out, rescan them into like that healthcare facility's EMR.
Okay.
And send them with copies. Yes.
And that actually sounds like a great way of always having one with you, if that's important to you, that you could take a picture of it or scan a copy and like have it on your phone.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a list of some of those frequently considered questions that we mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. I think we'll hand this over to Blythe to let us know questions that may have come through on the chat, or if there's questions at the top of your mind, if you want to write them in the chat, and then we can do our best to answer what's on your mind.
Thank you, Amy and Fiona. We did have you addressed the question about schools, and you addressed the question about electronic copies. I'm going to go through the chat and see what else is here. But while I do that, we do have, I want to invite Blair Whitworth, who's with us tonight. I know that she has personal experience with having done advanced directives with her son, and she has said she's willing to talk about her experience with it, and it was a positive experience. So Blair, if you would please share.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. I'm Blair. My son is named Bubba, and he passed away almost a year ago from a rare neurological condition. And I decided to do advanced directives when he was about age 7. So he passed away when he was 10 and a half. And the timing of it was actually perfect for me. Well, for my son. So he had really low tone overall in his body. And typically, children like him with his condition, we spend a lot of time in the winters in the hospitals just from respiratory illnesses. And, and as he kind of aged, those hospitalizations got more intense, um, and they started to become more frequent. So they weren't necessarily just in the wintertime, they were starting to happen throughout, outside of cold and flu season. So, um, and I was really starting to see his body and his condition with his respiratory status change. And I was at a point where the pulmonologist that we had didn't view his condition the same way that I saw it, didn't view me as an expert in my child. And that was very hard for me. So I spoke with a few of my son's specialists that I really valued, and just kind of started talking about, I'm seeing these things. Um, can you give me advice about what you would suggest in a situation? Should it be a need for an intubation or a tracheostomy? Really questions like that. And I had a great relationship. So they were able to provide me with a lot of feedback. I also did a lot of research. CPN, of course, was very helpful with a lot of resources with these advanced directives. And I actually called our palliative care team and said, I really think this needs to be done now. And one of our palliative doctors actually said, I don't know if we're at that point yet. And I told him, I think we are. I'm like, I want to do this now. And he's like, are you sure? I'm like, 100%. So we had that meeting with our palliative care doctor and my son's complex care doctor. I went in pretty much knowing that I was signing a pulse form for a DNR. Where I was unsure about was still kind of the DNI aspect. And we kind of talked through that because, uh, um, I looked at my child's quality of life. I knew that a trach was probably not in his best interest for quality of life, but I still struggled with if he was needing to be intubated for any type of illness, for his body just to temporarily be intubated. And we were able to kind of come to a conclusion, okay, DNI with an asterisk, unless we deemed it reversible. So if we viewed that, he was dealing with an illness, we could intubate him and we thought his body would be able to recover from that intubation, then we would proceed with that. So we were all kind of on the same page. And it felt really great just kind of having that all signed, having our forms, and accessibility for me. So I put it in a red folder. I kept it by my front door. So if I called 911, I knew exactly where it was as we were leaving the house. And about a month later, after I actually signed those forms, we rushed my son to the hospital with respiratory distress. And they came in and said, we were in the PICU. They were trying pretty much everything they could to help his respiratory status, and it just kept declining. And as you know, if anybody's been in that situation, it seems about like 100 people in a room when this is going on, and it's all happening very quick. When they pulled me aside and said, we're not sure he's going to make it. And they asked about my advanced directives. I said, I have them. They're here. They had them electronically in the system, but anytime we were in the hospital, they always asked to make sure that those were still our wishes. So in that situation, especially with it being so recent, I was grateful that we had that conversation, that I had those farms, that I really knew what we were going into. And then of course with that, after we were kind of able to stabilize them, that trach talk came up again with our providers. And we kind of went back through talking about the DNI and revisited it. And I think an important thing that my team, our palliative team, always emphasized is that if I don't want to show these forms, I don't have to show them, you know? And like I would send my son to school, he had a one-on-one nurse, and I would not send the pulse form with him to school because I said, I don't want decisions made if I'm not there, if anything rapid is happening. But I always felt confident in my decisions. And of course, throughout the rest of his life, you know, we always reassessed it. We checked in where his quality of life was and made sure it was all in line with where we wanted his quality of life. And at the end of life, when we decided to officially change him to hospice, and when we were taking him out of the hospital for the last time, you know, I just scratched out that line that had the asterisk of where the DNI portion was, unless deemed reversible, because we knew at the point we weren't reversible and we were going home and going to be removing respiratory support. So that's kind of our story with that.
Thank you, Blair. I appreciate, it's such a good example because it takes place over time, and you show how the role, how putting them in place happened over time, and how you used them over time, and how you revisited your decisions over time. I don't know, Amy and Fiona, if you want to add anything or respond to what Blair shared.
Yeah, thanks so much, Blair, for speaking so beautifully and poignantly about this. I really appreciated how you were able to shed light on this being something that empowered you as a parent. It didn't take rights away, and that it was like a very active, fluid process where you were still able to engage in ongoing decision making, even with like this template of decisions that you had made, you know, and that there were ways for you to personalize it for your family and your son. I did have one question. I was curious what counseling you got around, like what EMS would have done with that asterisk DNI at home. Was there ever a discussion about that?
Yeah, we always talked about if EMS was coming into a situation with a DNI with our asterisk, that we were telling them that we only had a DNR at that point, that a DNI would more be in a hospital. That way we just felt like we had more resources once we got to a hospital, more information.
Yeah. I think legally EMS would have had to look at that as like intubation okay, since there was some grayness to it.
Can I raise a question that came into the chat? Amy, who is in Washington State, asked if parents can avoid calling 911 if they have a Molster pulse in place, but their child is not in hospice or outpatient palliative care. Does that form give you permission legally to avoid calling 911?
I don't think so, because someone still has to declare that the patient died. I think that could get legally very murky, so I wouldn't recommend that. What I would recommend doing is, if you're kind of anticipating or worrying about that event, you could bring a copy of your pulse to your local like fire department and police station. And then when and if you have to make that phone call, initiate it by saying, you know, my child has a DNR pulse and has passed at home. You could also, you know, in tandem with making that phone call to 911, call the pediatrician, so that they're aware that all of this is happening. And that hopefully ensures that when EMS shows up at your house, they are like managing the situation appropriately and sensitively. But I think you would want to still contact them.
Yeah. Is there a lot of very, very, everyone is well-intentioned, but in the absence of some of this stuff, there can be things that have to be done that can be traumatic for everyone, actually, not just the parent or the child, but the emergency responders too. One question that came in from Naomi when you were talking, Fiona, or about, or Amy, it doesn't matter, about signing, who signs the orders. Is there actually a place on those orders for second and third decision makers, like guardians, grandparent, godparent, you know, if not me, then how much room is there?
So on the advanced directives, you can, because you can customize advanced directives to anything in terms of healthcare decision makers. So if you have primary and Boolean operators matter here too. In other words, if two parents are the primary, it can say this one, and then the secondary, tertiary. And when you're customizing them, standard forms usually have secondary and tertiary. But when you are making your own, you can make that list as long as it needs to be.
Okay.
So it does not have to follow a standard form. When you're talking about the signature on a post form, there is usually must be signed by the provider and dated, and then by one of the healthcare power of attorneys.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes, I think, Naomi, I think that answered your question. You can, if it didn't, feel free to.
Well, no, we have a post, but I don't remember that being an option to add a second or third. I know I've signed it and his physician signed it. But knowing that there's the opportunity to have a second and third is good to know. I just was wondering if that is actually on the post form. So I don't have an advanced directive for him. I have the post.
The post would not be your signature is appropriate for that on the post. You are the person making that decision. It would be in the setting of advanced directives where you would designate additional secondary or tertiary decision makers if you are not available. And you can even set what settings you are not available that they could take over decision making. So great question, but it's typically not on the post and more on those futuristic advanced documents.
Naomi,
Can I
you
ask
might.
just a quick follow-up to that?
Sure.
Oh, sorry.
Yes.
It was just, so if my signature is on the post and something happens to me and I'm the primary and sole caregiver, something happens to me, we have the post. So they would honor that provided it's produced, or would they go, if it's not produced, they would go to someone else and ask what to do? So if I'm incapacitated or unavailable and the post is not available.
That's a great question. So I think that there would still be another conversation with whoever is the next in line decision maker. And what that speaks to is the importance of sharing with them, like whoever are the backup decision makers, they should know what your wishes are for your son and why, so that they honor those choices. I think a lot of medical teams, like if there was this very nuanced situation that you're describing, I think a lot of medical providers would like encourage that backup decision maker to honor your wishes, but it would simplify the process if that person already understood what your decisions were and why.
And presumably, if the most was part of the record, then they could reference the record, even if Naomi wasn't physically present.
Correct.
Yeah.
Agree.
Naomi, I was going to also recommend to you, if you're not sure where to find a healthcare power of attorney for your state, you can ask at your child's like primary care provider office. They should be able to find that and hopefully complete it with you if you want to designate additional like backup decision makers.
Yeah. Thank you, Fiona. Stephanie did put into the chats, she messaged it to me that that because we're so comfortable with this, there would be for the advanced directives originate with families. Like what are your wishes? Whereas medical orders, whether it's the most form or the post form, that is those are provider orders. So provider orders can't be done without, of course, the wishes of the patient and family. So those, but they are complementary versions of the same thing. And that's I believe Fiona and Amy sort of said that, but we can sort of remind you of that these are the source, not the source, but the voice is a little different. Maybe that's the word. I'm aware that it's been an hour. I'm grateful to Amy and Fiona for this and for your framework and your very clear outlining and explanation of everything. These are things that are information. These are like facts about what these things are and how they help, which is phase 1. Phase 2 is implementation and all the emotion that goes with that. And you can't get to phase 2 without going through phase 1. But we want to acknowledge that it's all easier to talk about than to do, because the nature of this is sad and distressing that we're even having these conversations, that you're even having to have a conversation like what Blair was saying, like, under what condition will I not be intubating my son to help with breathing? But if you're in it, you understand why, because at the end of the day, well-being takes many, many shapes. And there are ways, these are sort of the surreal ways that we work to protect our child's well-being, whatever that means, for you and for your child and your family.